This is chapter 24, part 3. We left off part 2 by looking at allopatric speciation, in which there's some kind of geographic barrier preventing two populations from reproducing, and it also prevents gene flow. We're going to be picking up this one by looking at sympatric speciation, which is also called same country, because it incorporates an overlapping boundary. So you have two populations living in the same place, and reproduction can occur between them. So we talked about polyploidy in a few chapters prior to this. At this point, you should be familiar with polyploidy being more than the standard number of chromosomes in cells, usually due to accidents during cell division. Non-disjunction would result in polyploidy cells. Going back to what we looked at a while back at this point, we discussed that some living things exist as N, some living things exist as 2N or diploid, some living things exist as 3 or 4N or 6N or 8N, and a lot of those living things happen to be plants. So we're going to be looking at that going on here in the next few slides. So our first example where we're talking about polyploidy would be called autopolyploid, and it's called that because the new organism has more than two chromosome sets and they all came from the same species. Moving from left to right, we can see that we have a 2N cell and N equals 2N equals 6. And then each of these chromosomes, these are homologs, they'll make a copy of them as they go through the cell cycle. And that one cell would look like this. Each of the red ones made a copy of itself, so instead of being 2 red ones, there's now 4. Well, what if cytokinesis never happened for whatever reason? Well, that would be accidental. And that's kind of what we were talking about with polyploidy right here, accidental. So if cytokinesis never happened and this cell remained as 4N and it didn't die, it would produce or start producing gametes that are 2N, and 2N would equal 6. So gametes would now be what the original organism was before this happened. That would give rise to organisms that are 4N, and that's kind of what we had happen with plants. And those plants were viable and they were fertile, so we had a biologically new species that existed as a 4N organism. Now this happened to have occurred again, the same process, and that's why we have octoploid cells or 8N cells, and those are not uncommon at all with plants. In our next example, we're going to be talking about allopolyploids, which is where there's a couple different species involved. In this particular instance, there's species A and B. Species A, 2N equals 4. Species B, 2N equals 6. There's been occurrences where there's been meiotic errors within one species, resulting in unreduced gametes containing 4 chromosomes apiece. So there was some non-disjunction going on. This gamete was able to fuse with a gamete of a different species, in this case N equaled 3, because 2N equaled 6, so N equals 3, and we were able to have a hybridized organism that contained 7 chromosomes. Because it contained 7 chromosomes, it was producing gametes with 7 chromosomes, and this one was producing its normal gamete still, where N equaled 3. And this gamete and this gamete could recombine again to create an allopolyploid, where 2N equals 10. Bottom line is this: allopolyploids are when two different organisms are able to recombine their gametes to create a different diploid set. So it's multiple sets of chromosomes, two different species. Sympatric speciation can also result from habitat differentiation and sexual selection. We're going to be talking about habitat differentiation right now. And that's where a new ecological niche opens up. If a species can start using its environment in different ways, it can make the most of its environment a little bit differently than it had before. The definition of ecological niche is where you live, your habitat, and how you use your surroundings to survive, or how you get used by your surroundings. That's what a niche is. So as organisms come and go, migrate, or what have you, different resources can be made more available or less available, and species could have to adapt as a result. Well, this change in ecological niche could result in organisms filling their ecological niche a little bit differently, or using different resources than other members of their very same population, which would change their unique personal niche and keep them or separate them from the remaining groups of their population. Now looking at sympatric speciation using sexual selection. We have two different types of fish. Both are cichlids. And in this particular instance, the females have a preference of selecting the male that has the coloration of their rightful species. And that's the only thing that really keeps females selecting that type of males is the coloration. When they mate with the other species, they are able to produce viable and fertile offspring, though. But because they sexually select the males of their own species, they are said to be different species. Now, when these researchers exposed the two male populations of fish to normal light, you can see right here that the species, they do have different colorations. Therefore, the females of this particular species would always select these males, and the females of this species would always select those males. But when the researchers changed the color of lighting in the controlled habitat that these fish lived in to an orange light, well, the two fishes, they had the same color. And the females of this species would breed equally with these males or those males. And the females of this species would breed equally with these males or those males. So in other words, they weren't able to really tell which males were from which species, and their offspring were viable and fertile. But, once again, under normal light, these females would always select these males, and these females would always select those males, which is sexual selection. Because when they reproduce with the opposite males, and they can produce viable and fertile offspring, this does suggest that divergent evolution has occurred relatively recently because they are able to produce viable and fertile offspring. How did this divergent evolution occur? Well, it had to be sympatrically because they're living in the same body of water. So to recap allopatric and sympatric speciation, allopatric occurs as a result of some kind of geographic barrier, mountain, large body of water, that blocks gene flow. And in sympatric speciation, there's some kind of a reproductive barrier that emerges, whether that's, like we looked at with those cichlids, a sexual selection type of thing, or otherwise, but the organisms live in the same area. Concept 24.3 is looking at hybrid zones, which illustrates how some organisms are related and have diverged. And this very well could be the case with those cichlids in some years to come. A hybrid zone is where there's a boundary overlap of a habitat between two different species. And as a result of that boundary overlap, species A will come into contact with species B, and we can see that they are separate in what their offspring look like. the mating of the offspring will be of mixed ancestry, so you'll have both species involved in that offspring. And let's take a look at what that could look like here. For example of hybrid zones, we're going to be looking at toads. There's the yellow-bellied toads and then the fire-bellied toads. The yellow-bellied occupy this yellow zone on the map, and the fire-bellied occupy the red zone on the map. The deep red line indicates where there's a hybrid zone or an overlap where both of these toads exist. Looking at this graph right here, the graph shows that individuals with specific allele frequencies closer to 1 are the yellow-bellied toads, and those with allele frequencies closer to 0 are the fire-bellied toads. So we happen to be looking at a gene with a specific form of an allele that happens to be more common with the yellow-bellied frogs and with the fire-bellied frogs. Individuals with intermediate frequencies, right in this range right here, are hybrids. So they're part yellow-bellied, part fire-bellied. What makes them separate species? Well, in this case, they are not viable. The offspring are not viable. The hybrids have high rates of embryonic mortality. They have morphological abnormalities, and since they have such a hard time surviving, they also have a hard time reproducing their own viable offspring. So, once again, two different species, they are able of reproducing and having offspring. Their offspring can have offspring too, but the ability of these two guys' offspring to survive is very, very low. They're misconfigured, and they're highly abnormal frogs. So how do these hybrid zones happen to form? To start with, we can see that we move from here over to here. Let's talk right here at number 1 first. There's 4 populations that are shown. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there is gene flow that goes on between those 4 populations. So they have to be relatively close to one another in order for that gene flow to exist. So how do hybrid zones form? Well, hybrid zones, we can see those are right here. To one of those populations, something has to happen that blocks the gene flow that was going on right here. Whatever happens to this population, there's some kind of barrier, and there's no more gene flow with the other 3 populations. And these other 3 populations, gene flow still can occur between the 3. This one's kind of left out because there's this barrier to that gene flow. Number 3, the population that we see on the top here begins to diverge away from the other 3 populations. In other words, it's changing in response to the environment, and it's kept separate from these ones. That barrier still exists. Moving from 3 into 4, we can see this red line here, which started to dash 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 solid, and then dash 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 gone. That barrier to the gene flow is now removed for whatever instance, and gene flow is able to occur between this population and these populations again. However, keep in mind that this population has undergone changes over the course of time while that barrier was in place. Well, these guys, they're still compatible with these populations down here, but they are different species at this point, and we have a hybrid zone that's established when gene flow is able to occur between those organisms, and those organisms are capable of producing hybrids, such as we saw with those toads. And we'll pick up with the remaining portion of chapter 24 in our next video.